turn off your cell phones if you have one.
I don't think so.
You should each have on your binders the PowerPoint presentations of for two of the papers, Dan Clerman and Gary Richardson. You can insert them in the proper part of the binder. We have a session now with three papers. The presenters are each going to have 20 minutes, and they're asked to stay within that limit. They'll be followed by the three discussants, who will have 7 minutes each. And again, we ask them to stay within that limit. We're going to start with Saeed Arjomand. Saeed.
Well, if anyone compared the the tentative program with the final one, you would have noticed there's a very slight change in my title. But that's the reason why I mention this is that this different title really has to do with the structure of the paper and my theoretical argument. Because at first I thought I'd compare 17th century and early 18th century Safavid Empire with the Ottoman one, because that's a period of centralization, and I thought I'd have two central powers. But that was a year and a half ago when we agreed. But as I thought about what I was going to say and so forth, I thought that, well, if I'm talking about developmental patterns and different trajectories beginning, then the starting point should be 1501, when Shiism was declared state religion of Iran, and the Ottoman Empire remained Sunni. So that is the starting point. So I push it back a century. Not that it kind of it makes sense for this particular project. Although I think from the point of centralization, it may have been also made sense to concentrate it on the 17th century and 18th century. But that period is included anyway. Now, let me just begin with Max Weber, and let me say I'm a comparative historical sociologist, so that is my perspective on this, and it is a Weberian perspective. And I would say that with Weber, it's if we move from the Protestant ethic to his general comparative sociology of world religions, you have this considerable broadening of perspective, because in the latter part of his work, what he's really concerned with is the construction of meaning. He explored religions as these grandiose patterns of construction of meaning and their consequences for the economy, but not only for the economy, but also for law, political organizations, and so forth. Now, I think in this general perspective, then I think there are two things we need to think about separately for our purpose of this conference. One is the direct impact of religion on economic ethics, political ethics, and what have you. But the second one, which in fact is the one that I'll concentrate on, is the indirect effect. How does the indirect effect work? It works because of Weber's idea is that there are these developmental patterns, the most important being rationalization, that take place in different spheres of life. And they have different tempos, they happen at different times, and so forth. So bureaucracy gets rationalized at one point, capitalism at another, law at another, religion much earlier, in an earlier period. Now, what's interesting is that then these developmental patterns within each field has an impact on the other field. That's what I mean by the indirect impact. So the rationalization of the bureaucracy, in fact, can have an impact on the religious field and vice versa, or not have an impact empirically to be determined. So this indirect effect, I think, is very important. These developmental patterns that I'm talking about reflect the major impact of world religions in the political, legal, and economic spheres of life. And kind of after the first direct impact, there is a series of indirect impacts, largely through institutional patterns, through shaping the different institutions in society. Now, I want to concentrate especially on the political sphere and the legal sphere, political organization. I think some of us have argued in the past 20, 30 years in comparative sociology that Weber may have been right about the impact of religion, Protestant ethic in this case, on capitalism, spirit of capitalism, but that impact, I think, is you should expect a much closer connection and much closer impact of religion on politics. Why? Because they both have to do with symbolic construction of reality, and indeed it may well be that the impact on politics is primary from the spillover from religious field to the political one, and then through politics and law then you have creation of an institutional framework that could have very important consequences for economic action, but indirectly. Now, I think this emphasis, this nexus between religion or culture more generally and power has been emphasized in the much more recent developments in civilizational analysis. Elias, to mention one, links his civilizing process with state formation. Eisenstadt, who also talks about in his later work the close nexus between culture, religion, and power in development of what he calls axial civilizations. And I think and my own contribution to the civilizational analysis, in fact, focuses on these developmental patterns, and I highlight what I call value rationalization as a very important process, especially for these cross-cutting influences from one field to another. I argue that, in fact, the process is very different from instrumental rationalization, means ends, or formal rationalization. It has much more to do with what Kant called the faculty of judgment. So it's much more like what you do in aesthetics. It's or what Weber calls Sinnzusammenhang. Things hang together in a meaningful way. It's like poetry rhyming, or you have one kind of institution in economics. It can't be too jarring from what you have in law or politics. And the way you do this is much, much looser than kind of constructing a syllogism or following any formal or instrumental rationalization for that matter. And this is really critical for the kind of indirect influence that I'm talking about and I try to look for. Now, that influence is clear in the political sphere. That's why my paper begins with looking at the consequences of this fact, that Shiism, until then, both countries were Sunnis officially. In 1501, there's a millenarian revolution, and Shah Ismail declares Shiism as the state religion of Iran. And I think the first path, that divergent path that follows almost immediately, has to do with conceptions of rulership, monarchy, kingship, and has to do with different notions of authority. So that's where I would say the direct impact of Shiism begins. And that's what I look at then. The kind of, and later on, I think we'll see, I try to see how that impact, in fact, the structure of authority that emerges in Iran has an impact on economic activity by looking at guilds and minority merchants, trade, and so forth. Now, so this is, I think, as I said, this is this notion of, if you like, mutual interaction between different developmental patterns in different fields. In this case, law and politics and economics is my focus. I would say also, just going back to the very brief exchange, another thing that I try to do, and going back to the exchange on the small c versus capital C, the globalization, competition, rivalries, etc., are, of course, a very dominant fact of contemporary life, but they've always been there. And in this case, I argue that these two patterns I'm looking at are intertwined, because there was considerable interaction between the Safavid and Ottoman empires then. It's not only with the West that people interacted. There was quite a lot of interaction. And I argue that, in fact, you would get a very interesting perspective on the Ottoman developments if you begin from 1501 and look at this wild millenarian revolution in Iran, which did have ambitions for world domination, and in fact which did begin in Anatolia. It was kind of much closer on the other side, but the system in Iran was much more fragile, so it collapsed first, and the Shiite empire was established there by the Safavids, but in fact his followers were mostly Turks from Anatolia, eastern Anatolia. Now, one interesting thing is that you have these old revolutions produce a large body of exiles that are all over the place. By the way, yesterday I saw, if you just give me 1 second, if you stop the clock from ticking, that Safavid revolution produced all these exiles who went to the Ottoman Empire, who went to India, who went to Central Asia, tried to mobilize the rulers against this millenarian revolution in Iran. Same thing's happening here. Yesterday, New York, the Los Angeles Times, it says, for some in Beverly Hills, ballots are too Farsi. And you see this ballot sheet going out in Persian with the protest. And this man called Jimmy Delshad, I suspect his name was Jamshid originally. He's running for mayor of Beverly Hills. So the Iranians are trying to do the same thing, make same trouble here, but against much worse odds, I would say now. But they did try to probably persuade more direct interference too. Luckily, people in the State Department didn't know the difference between N and Q, and so they went to the wrong country for Iran. But certainly, as far as trying goes, the Iranians did try exiles, and they did the same. Iranian exiles went to the Ottoman Sultan, said, come on, get rid of these people, put us back. They went to the Uzbek Khans and said exactly the same thing. Now, one consequence of the ones going to the Ottoman Empire was that Selim, of course, had to suppress the revolution on his side. Selim I, the Grim, he suppresses very grimly. Now, people who were activists in this anti-Rizalbash campaign went on to build the very impressive Ottoman judiciary system. What's really unique, that you have the judges, the qadis, and the muftis appointed all by the Sultan, and through the Sheikh al-Islam, this Kemal Pashazadeh the first, the Abu Saud, who's a Kurd, by the way, Mountain Turk, whatever, who was kind of moved from Iran there. But these people kind of were very important. And I think their conception of imamate, I can't go to detail now. You see that Lutfi Pasha, the Grand Vizier, puts forward the theory that the Sultan is the Caliph, God's Caliph, by the way, same as Metin's going to talk about for the Umayyads, and also the Imam. And that was a counterclaim against the Safavid Shah. The Safavids argued he was a 14-year-old war hero. They thought that he was a divine incarnation. And the system, and I think that was transformed into charisma of lineage, but it did also bring about a very important change in the conception of royalty, conception of monarchy. Until then, the conception of monarchy was shared in the two countries. It was basically the Persian idea of Padshahi, or universal monarchy, with important Turkish elements, especially regarding law. The Turkish idea of law, Yasuf, Chengiz Khan, Quintus prototypically, had an impact. Now, this idea of law was transformed to the idea of Kanun and a certain form of Kanun consciousness by the Ottomans. That was the dynastic law, the law of the dynasty. Mehmed the Conqueror, in fact, proclaimed the first important subjects of Raya, Kanunname. Then in 1501, the very same year as you have the revolution of Shah Ismail in Iran, Bayezid re-proclaims that with added so-called law decrees, Kanuns. The idea is that it's the law of the dynasty, the law of the Ottoman dynasty, Kanun al-Osman or Kanun Osmani and so forth. Now, this was very important, and it created this form of Kanun consciousness. And originally under Suleiman, the lawgiver, incidentally, that's what he was called, not magnificent, This developed. The Chancellor, the Nishanji, the Sheikh al-Islam, Abu Saud, etc., and the Qadis, and they tried to use the madrasa people to have an integrated system. The integration didn't work too well, but basically what you had was these two elements, the Qanun and the Sharia. And the Ottomans were the first to have the Qadis implement state law or dynastic law or Qanun. That was a major innovation. The other one is the devshirme system that most of you are probably familiar with, the levy of Christian boys from Balkans who were raised as the Sultan's slaves, and they became the dominant elite of the Ottoman Empire. And the kind of what's interesting in there, well, I'm not going to get very far, I can see, is that in this case you did have a development of what I call a patrimonial bureaucratic empire. What you do have is that as Weber defined it, as Montesquieu noticed in case of the Ottoman Empire, there is no distinction between the palace. The palace is the center of the political system. In the Ottoman case, the service, palace service, which the pages would begin with, that would be trained for, was called the Enderun service of internal service in the palace. The outside service was Birun, and the outside service was governorship of provinces as well as military operations. Now, with the Safavids, it was a different thing. The Qizilbash were really transformed this war hero's charisma into charisma along the Sufi directions, and he was considered an infallible Morshid Kamil and so forth. So that introduced a kind of an element, sacral element to Padshahi, which really didn't fit, and it collapsed with the Safavid ones. But the most important consequence is the development in what's distinctive. This is what's distinctive about the Ottoman Empire. What's distinctive about the Safavid Empire is the emergence of what I call hierocratic authority. For the first time, you have with Sheikh al-Karaki, very interesting argument that you can read about in detail, that the mullahs, the mujtahids, the Shiite doctors have a certain ex ante appointment by the 6th Imam, confirmed by the 12th Imam in hiding, that gives them independent authority, independent of the king. And this emergence of hierocratic authority was very important, because when we get to the 17th century in Iran, you have two kinds of authority. And it's through hierocratic authority that the influence of Shiism is transmitted. Now, I won't have time. You can look at the details on the guilds, on consumption of coffee, and on the law of Waqf, etc. What is interesting is that there's some creativity, but I think in balance the effect is really quite negative. The Shiite law considered the minorities were very important, especially the Armenian minorities, in trade, because Shah Abbas had brought them in the 16th, 17th century. And they were very helpful with the centralization of power in Iran. Let me talk about that and then get back to the influence of Shiism. What Abbas the Great did in the 17th century was really try to imitate the Ottoman system, if you like. That's the competition rivalry. He had conquered Caucasia, Georgia. He thought he would have this royal slave corps, and he also used the gunpowder kind of before the rebels could get hold of guns. He kind of had the gunpowder revolution was harnessed by the king. He did set up a royal corps of slaves in imitation of the Ottoman Empire. That was temporary, and once he couldn't have the Caucasia anymore, that thing collapsed. But in creating that, he also created what I usually call the state mercantilism, a system that he himself had monopoly of silk trade and made various trade concessions. And these Armenians were very important in financing that. There's one detail I'll draw your attention to in the paper. The Armenian merchants were really richer than the Shah. They had more money. They had huge amount of money. You have the figures there from Chardin. And they were very closely connected to the royal slaves. This is a kind of an unusual phenomenon, because the Armenians, they also financed recruitment largely from Georgia, but also Armenia. Now that created a kind of an interdependence between the two, which was very important in Iran. Now, let's go back to the influence of Shiism through creating an autonomous hierarchy. Now, the Shiites, of course, the mullahs very much were put several, there were several waves of forced conversion. Armenians were the most important merchants, but the Jews were quite important and numerous, and also were the Indians, incidentally. There was a very large Indian Banya minority traders and financiers. There were repeated pressures on them to convert. And of course, one element of Shiite law specifically, which is worse than the Sunni one, the Hanafi one, it considers the so-called people of the book actually polluting, not only infidels, but polluting. So the ulama, there were several decrees forbidding them to come out when it would rain. And that's kind of a clear negative impact of religion on the economy. But in general, there was kind of a balance between there was a kind of a structural dependence, I say, between the military administrative elite, the slave corps, royal slave corps, and the minority merchants, which kind of created a very complicated system. I argue that probably the Safavid state was on balance more predatory than the Ottoman one, because largely public law didn't develop as much. Instead of the Qanun development in Safavid Empire, you largely had development of hierocratic authority in Shiism, and that was really not as helpful to. And then I look at also these patterns of the impact on, actually the bulk of the paper is about that, of this structure of authority on two kinds of things, on guilds, and I think they were more tightly controlled in Iran than in the Ottoman Empire, and on the madrasas, on the what I call the educational philanthropic complex that developed. Now, one interesting thing, and then I think that part of the paper you can read, but one interesting thing is that, of course, the eunuchs in both royal households were tremendously important, and I choose the example of their endowments of big colleges and mosques and so forth, and so were the ladies of the harem, the mother of the king especially, and the princesses and so forth. But one interesting difference again, and I'll end on this, is that the Safavid military administrative elite was not nearly as well integrated. You don't have that many endowments by them directly, so that kind of means that they're not integrated into the patronage of civil society as much as the Ottomans were. Thank you.